teams in the National Trust, so we do sometimes, but it means that so it just takes me a while to find the right button. So share content is the little arrow. So I'm pressing the little arrow now. So here we go. So I'm clicking on the PowerPoint. Let's see what happens. PowerPoint Live, preparing your slides.
There we go.
Oh, does that work? Can you see that?
Yes, I can see that.
That's excellent.
Perfect. Over to you, Tony.
Thank you very much indeed. Hello, everyone. These online presentations are always a little bit odd because I'm throwing it out into the void, and I can only when I say hello, everyone, I kind of assume that you can all hear me and you're all mentally going hello, Tony, but that may not be the case. But I'll have to take that on trust. But it's great to be able to talk to you, because banging on about the National Trust is kind of what I'm paid to do, and it's what I actually enjoy doing. So whether you'll enjoy listening to it or not is quite another matter. But let's see how far we get. I understand you've heard from my very esteemed and wonderful colleague Fiona Hall, who gave you very much a kind of a property perspective, the actual detail of working sustainably with historic houses. What I'm going to give you is very much the national perspective, because that's where I sit in the organisation. I have my role is to think about the future of the kind of experiences we provide for people. And a big part of that is thinking about how people are responding to those experiences, what people need from us, and how what we offer needs to change to meet the changing world in which we live, and people's changing needs. And that's kind of what I'd like to talk to you about. Before I do any of that, I'm aware that Ian did mention that there would be people perhaps not from the UK, and that I shouldn't just assume that when I say National Trust, people say, "Oh yeah, National Trust, yeah, gotcha," because you may not. So if you can bear it, just a quick background to who the National Trust is. We are an independent charity, which is fundamental to everything I'm going to say, actually, because we don't get any support from government. We have no divine right to exist, and we could go bust quite easily. We're entirely dependent on our own efforts, so we only eat what we kill, as they say. So everything I'm going to talk about presupposes the importance of some kind of business model or financial support of any piece of heritage. Somehow has to be sustained, and has to find sources of income, and that is very much that's very much a background to what I'm going to say. What we look after, we're most famous, I suppose, for historic houses. We have more than 300 of those open to the public, and gardens. Although that is probably not the most important part or the largest part of what we do, because we also own a considerable amount of land, sort of 250,000 hectares or so. 775 miles of the coast of England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, and many buildings that are not historic houses, such as archaeological monuments, industrial heritage sites, and residential properties. We own about villages, pubs. Kind of all human life is here, really. So it's a really broad portfolio, and it means that And it has implications for what I'm going to say, because while we look after historic houses, it is historic houses in the context of the land that surrounds them, and historic houses in the context of all the other aspects of the historic environment that are of interest to us. So I'll touch on that as I walk through, but that's just a little bit of a background to who the National Trust is. And the final bit of context for the National Trust is our business model is very much based on membership. We have more than 5.5 million members who pay an annual subscription, and that is while we have quite a lot of different sources of income, that is by some distance the largest and most important, and that will become clear as I go through. So that's a bit of background. So let's pitch in to what I'm going to talk about. So we got a lot of these things. That's probably what we're most famous for. This is this isn't a National Trust place. This is a capriccio, which is an architectural painting that takes lots of different buildings and builds them into a kind of fantasy. And all of these belong to the National Trust, and we got even more where these came from. So the question, historic houses, what are they good for? Well, hopefully we can get to a point by the end of by the end of my session that the answer will not be the same as what war is good for, which, as I'm sure all of you Edwin Starr fans out there know, is absolutely nothing. But I think historic houses are worth a great deal more than that. But what they are good for, I think, is changing. And here's an image from the late 1960s, which is the traditional image of historic house visiting. You know, it's a privilege for you to be allowed in here. Here's a scholarly guidebook. Wander around and contemplate the historic interiors, and try not to touch anything. And that's the original model. And but that original model has exploded in volume and in the number of lives it touches over the last sort of 60 years since this photograph was taken. And we're in a different world now, and so there are some real challenges we have to, anybody managing and looking after the historic environment has to face into. The first and most obvious one is the classic, the oldest conundrum in the book, the balance between growth and conservation. We conserve things so that people can enjoy them. The more people that enjoy them, the more conservation challenges that we get. And so how you balance the need to provide access and benefit with the impact that access and benefit brings is a perennial conundrum. And when we first started, you know, when I joined the National Trust in the 1990s, you know, our biggest properties had, you know, our blockbuster, wow, this is a huge property, would get 200,000 visitors a year. You know, most properties would get, a thriving property would get 50 to 70,000 visitors a year. We thought that was pretty good back then. I mean, nowadays we have several properties around the 500,000 mark. 200,000 visits is now not uncommon. If you've got 200,000 visits a year, you're just one of the pack now. So that is a massive increase in scale in terms of footfall. And how we manage that means that we can't just carry on opening them in the same old way as we used to. There is a question mark about declining relevance. I'm just going to pause for a slurp of coffee before it goes cold. By which I mean that in 1970, when frankly there was bugger all else to do, a wander around a historic house and the thrill, the frisson that you might glimpse an earl was had an appeal that perhaps doesn't exist to new generations coming through. And there are aspects of the historic house offer that do appeal to an older demographic, and the demographic that is now coming to an age where they would naturally start to connect with historic houses is a different demographic, has different priorities, different views of different expectations of the experience they're going to get. So that we need to ensure that the historic house visit continues to be can connect and to be appealing to new generations as they come through. So that's just something we have to face into. And one of the things that worries us in the era of climate change, as a responsible environmental organisation, and the climate crisis is one of our 2 strategic priorities as an organisation. We cannot do otherwise as an environmental organisation who is concerned about the future of nature and landscape. The fact that our biggest income stream is dependent on this, what feels like an unsustainable, highly car-dependent visitor model. Our places, almost by very definition, tend to be remote, difficult to reach by public transport. Growth has inevitably meant more and larger, constant pressure for more larger car parks. There is a constant dilemma. We are looking, in order to maintain these places, in order to justify the benefit they bring, we have to attract visitors. But that doesn't. But all of this visitor mileage and all of this infrastructure doesn't feel sustainable in a 2022 context when environmental sustainability and climate change is so significant. And finally, and this has been, and we've seen this amplified many times, hugely over the last few years, is the other aspect of relevance is that these places have really contested histories. If we are our other strategic priority alongside the climate crisis is what we call everyone welcome, our need to be inclusive and to bring benefits to all parts of the nation. A lot of our houses have difficult and contested histories, and by opening these up and being honest about the past of our properties, we know that we bring ourselves into controversy and difficulty, and how we manage in a balanced and sensible and honest way the contested histories of these places is something that we cannot think about the future of the historic house without somehow facing into this. So it's these challenges really that I wanted to, how we might approach the challenges of running our historic estate in the context of these challenges, which is really what I want to talk to you about today. Hope that makes sense. There's one other question I would just like to raise as well, which is, inevitably, because of the scale of our organisation, we present, we're a guardian of a particular sort of view of the nation's heritage and the nation's past, but it is massively skewed towards country houses, and we're very much aware of the fact that the historic environment is far more than large country houses. Not all of these belong. Some of these belong to the National Trust. Most of them don't. So we've got Forth Inn Road, Paul McCartney's house, Queen Street Mill in Burnley, which doesn't belong to the National Trust, but is a classic example of large-scale industrial heritage. Moseley Road Baths in Birmingham, the Plaza Cinema in Stockport. These don't belong to the National Trust, but they are nonetheless, in their own way, all as significant as a historic house. But the classic historic house business model which has supported which has been our go-to for how you keep these places alive and funded, doesn't necessarily work for places like this. So we have to think in quite a new way when we think about broadening and creating a sustainable future across the whole historic environment. So that's the setup. So here we go then. So here's the key question. What might a sustainable future look like for historic buildings? And I'm starting from the principle that, in view of everything I've just said, a sustainable what's got us this far, which is days out to days out based around preserved historic interiors, where people get in their car and drive quite a long way to visit a house-based visitor attraction and then go home again, having sort of paused to sort of visit the gift shop and the tea room, as a way of providing a function for historic houses and a source of income for those historic houses, may not be the most appropriate or effective sustainable future for historic buildings, as given the challenges we've already looked at. So what might a sustainable future look like? Well, we think we've got some clues as to what that sustainable future might look like from our own experience, actually. A lot of what I will talk about today is from our own experience. Some of it isn't actually. Some of it I've drawn on some academic thinking that that's provoked us to think, which is separate to the National Trust, but which is thought-provoking, which we might want to sort of think about. But I've picked out 4 key factors that I think might give us some clues as to what a sustainable future might look like. And the first factor is local, which is, in our experience, the places that we care for that feel like the most thriving and the most relevant and the most dynamic tend to be ones that who play out to a local audience, not to an international audience or a tourist audience or a big day out audience, but to local people. And that's important for all kinds of ways, not least in terms of that environmental impact. And it's very much linked to the next point, which they are repeatable experiences. They are so it's moving from that sort of that long journey to visit somewhere and have a big day out to local, repeatable things you can do, places around the corner that you can visit again and again. Feels environmentally inherently more sustainable. We want our best places are useful. They're places where people do things that are part of people's lives, that provide them with value beyond simply passing some time or looking at things. They have use beyond the merely the mere passage of leisure time. And finally, this idea that our best places are rooted in community, have connections beyond the simple exchange of cash in return for a day out, that build themselves into that are part of the places and communities they serve. So actually that's kind of it, really. Once you've remembered those, once you've got your head around those 4 things, that's kind of more or less everything else I'm going to talk about. So if you want to nod off now, you won't miss anything else. So that's the summary. But I'm going to embroider a bit more on that. And I'm going to start by sort of underpinning that with the importance for us of the business model. Like I said, we own all these big places that have lots of visitors, and they have tea rooms and they have shops, and people come and we record visitor numbers. And for many years we thought, well, we run Vista Attractions. That's what we do. We're in the attractions business, and our competitors are, Legoland and the Tower of London. And our job is to attract day out visitors, and we'll place adverts saying, come to National Trust Properties. What a fantastic day out. Fun for all the family. Only X pounds to get in. You can spend a whole day and almost mimic the attractions business and think of our places in that way. But one of the big realizations for us was when you actually come right down to it, we're not actually in the attractions business. That's not what sustains the organization. And I don't think it's what can sustain the organization going forward. What we're really all about is, sorry about the poor placing of the photograph there. It's about membership and public benefit. We're a membership organization, and when you're a membership organization, actually it's not about one-off visits. It's about repeat visits, and as a charity it's about public benefit. It's about how are our places fulfilling the role that we know that historic places can fulfill to make people's lives better. How are we improving people's lives through these places? And we think there's a lot more to that than just tourist attractions. Of course, some of our places are tourist attractions and play a massively important part in local economies and in employment and in contributing to local society in that way. But a great deal more of them have really different roles to play. And you can see, and I'll just talk a little bit more about what those different roles might look like. Because as soon as you realize that you're in the membership business, not the attractions business, you realize that what you're actually trying to do is encourage people to build long-term relationships with place, to learn to love individual places, to form a bond with places, to connect at a deeper level with places they love, places that are close to them, places that mean something to them. And we recognize quite earlier on that there are particular aspects or qualities of our places that were particularly effective at fostering that kind of relationship. And I've put here things like the outdoors, play has been really important to us, and activity. So one of our most important partners, for example, one of the most important partners for particularly for my team in the National Trust is Sport England, which is the government's governing body for the promotion and development of sport and activity. And the reason why we work so closely with Sport England is that Sport England, as well as working with sports governing bodies to develop excellence in sport and to achieve Olympic medals, what's also important to them and to the government is to play a really important part in a healthy and active population, and to get as many people as possible involved in physical activity and achieving health outcomes. And they recognized in us and the fabulous environments we look after all over the country a partner who could really help them to achieve that. Because a park run, when it's set against the background of, as you can see in this image, somewhere fabulous like Fountains Abbey, is a more attractive and appealing park run because of the quality of the historic environment, or in other places it might be the quality of the natural environment. But all of these are powerful ways in which we can build relationship with place beyond the visitor attraction model. And building on this, we started to think about how do we invest in our places so that so that at the heart of our offer is repeatable, robust components. These images are all from another partnership with Sport England, which is to create a series of multi-use trails, for everything from pushchairs, wheelchairs, mobility, cycles. So they're about sort of 5 to 8 kilometer loops. We've built 10 of them so far. Flat, mostly 3 meter wide, accessible surfaces. But these are robust. They can be used all year round. They promote all kinds of access at all kinds of levels, and it just starts to help us to build these historic environments into accessible, appealing, and repeatable locations rather than places you have a one-off visit. And at all times, it's essential to follow the audience, and by following the audience, I mean we should always be audience led. We should always be responding to what audiences want from us. And there are many ways in which you can understand what the audience wants from you. You can do focus groups and questionnaires and pulse surveys, and you can buy into, and all of this is important. But the single most important way of learning from your audience is just watch them, listen to them. Your audience will tell you what they want to do. The audience tells you what they're interested in. A property I'll refer to later on, for example, a place called Attingham Park near Shrewsbury. One of the most significant things we did to develop Attingham Park, which is a classic National Trust 18th century house set in a sort of 250-acre deer park. I'm sure it's an absolutely classic. It was a sort of absolutely typical National Trust visit, but there is a particularly wonderful route within Attingham called the Mile Walk, which is, as you see, it's just a beautifully curated, lovely meander along the riverbank and through the rhododendrons that is about a mile, which is just perfect for a Sunday afternoon stroll with the whole family. And we noticed, and Attingham Park, like most other properties, was tended to do most of its business between March and October in high season. But we noticed after a few years that the Mile Walk was becoming a sea of mud in January and February. And the Mile Walk becoming a sea of mud between January and February was basically our audience telling us very loud and clear, I would like to be able to walk around this route all year round, please. And so one of the most significant things we did in the growth of Attingham Park, and I'll refer to it a bit later, is we just decided to put a really robust hog-in hard surface around that whole route, in a way that was consistent with the spirit of place and the nature of the landscape. But that was just us responding to the audience telling us this is what we want to do and this is when we want to do it. And it's down to us then to follow the lead of the audience. And Attingham was really probably the first major National Trust property to develop a real all year round business where its visitor numbers were balanced equally across all 4 quarters of the year. And that's because we listened to what people wanted from us. And we're having to listen particularly hard at the moment because our audience is telling us that their needs are changing and new audiences are telling us what they want to do. One of the things that was a big feature of lockdown was that our outdoor spaces suddenly saw a great upsurge in visitors. And a lot of these visitors were people we hadn't seen before, who were discovering spaces, particularly green spaces near urban centres, who were discovering these places for the first time. And there was a great upsurge in visiting, and that's telling us something about the importance of, and you can see some of them illustrated. So top right is Box Hill in Surrey. The bottom is Divis Mountain in Belfast. And another really significant place was Dovedale in the Peak District, which we took back ownership of the car park. Most National Trust places have about 70 to 80% National Trust member visits. At Dovedale, it's about 17% National Trust visits. So these are new audiences, and they're coming to these places. They're telling us that these are the kind of places that they want to visit, and we really need to respond to that. Interesting. I was chatting to the visitor reception staff at Dovedale a few months back, and because it's comparatively new to the National Trust, we have our own ways of managing the countryside, and we're going to have to change our thinking on some of that as we listen to our audience. Because I said to the visitor reception, so what are the most commonly asked questions that you get asked when people arrive? And it's basically, where can we splash in the stream and where can we have a barbecue? And of course, traditionally, the National Trust doesn't want you to splash in the stream and doesn't want you to have a barbecue. So listening to your audience means, okay, if that's what people want to do, how can we make it easier for people to splash in the stream safely? How can we allow people to have barbecues while protecting the natural environment and the historic environment at the same time? So those are the challenges that we have to do in order to follow the audience and listen to what they are telling us really loud and clear. And at the same time, we have to do all of this against a background of climate change, and that is going to make it. We're already having to think differently about the impact of climate change on our places. We've just taken on a research fellow from Exeter University to help us think about the impact of climate change on visit patterns, for example. It's interesting because normally one of the things we've discovered is the National Trust, clearly we get more visitors when the weather's nice, but when the weather's really hot, our visits drop off a cliff. And if the weather is going to be really, really hot much more of the time, what does that mean for our visit patterns? These are some of the questions we need to ask. We need to think about planting. What might the garden of the future look like? How do we adapt to the changing climatic conditions in the way we think about planning our gardens? How do we think about things like designing our gardens for more shade, for example, because that's what people will want. Path surfacing has become really important for us. Wetter winters, more storm conditions, more waterlogged ground, more people. The impact of people on gardens and the landscape is something how we plan for robust hard-wearing path surfaces in an appropriate way, in the right way, is going to be really important to ensuring that our places can function 12 months of the year in a much more uncertain climate. And the other picture you can see is an aerial view of the Dunham Massey estate. And thinking about how we might in the future, because at the moment, many of our estates like Dunham Massey have a sort of a core deer park of maybe 500 acres and a wider estate of maybe 3,000, in some cases 5,000 or more acres, which has very little access, that is has been traditionally largely given over to farming. How can we work with our tenants to open up much more of our land for access beyond the core garden and deer park? Because the basic maths suggests that 3,000 acres can swallow up in a sustainable and robust way many more visitors than 500 acres can. And so how do we make the most of our estate to provide fantastic more access for more people in a sustainable way on people's doorsteps, because Dunham Massey is perched right on the edge of Manchester. It's a fantastic place to appeal to as a green lung for local people from Altrincham, southwest Manchester, and there are many more places like that. So that's all part of our thinking. So that's all very well, but so far most of our attention has been on the outdoor elements of our historic places, and most of what I've been talking about refers to the outdoors. So the next question is clearly, so what does this mean for the built environment? That's all very well if you've got 600 acres of deer park or a rolling chunk of the Peak District, but what does it mean for the core historic house or the built asset at the heart of a heritage site? And I've got a few things to talk. I've got 3 things to talk about under this heading, really. Some of which and for the second one of these, I will abandon the National Trust's lived experience and go off to explore some academic thinking, which has been, which I've found really interesting, which just to provoke some discussion and thought, really. But really, the first, these themes for me are the first is the move. Well, I put here the move from fixed to programmable spaces, which is the shift from a historic asset being a set piece that you visit and admire once, to a historic asset being the stimulus for cultural activity and programming that people can engage with again and again. The second is theories of social space. I won't go into that. We'll come on to that in a moment. And the finally is adaptive reuse. How do we make these places useful? So really just a few ideas about how, as an organization, in the way we think about our houses, we have begun to make a shift in moving from just being an operator. In other words, we have all these places. Our job is to open the doors up at the start of the is to lay them out beautifully. But interpretation, people to ask if it's so the show is ready. Our job is to open up the doors. People come in, walk around the show, and off they go. And our job is basically to curate and open and shut, the operator. Whereas the programmer is if you approach these from a programmer's point of view, you think these are fantastic historic assets. They have fantastic collections. These can be the stimulus for all kinds of creative, cultural, dynamic activity that can keep people coming back and re-engaging with them again and again. How can we, as a programmer, think much more dynamically about the way we present these places? There are a few examples on this slide. The top slide, which is Dunham Massey again, which is the place we saw an aerial view of near Manchester. Possibly our most successful ever reprogramming of a historic space, which was in 2014, to coincide with the centenary of the outbreak of the First World War. We represented Dunham Massey as it was in the First World War, as a military hospital, stripped out temporarily the historic interiors, and re-engaged people just for a short period of 2 years with a completely different thematic look at one phase in the property's history, working with the Royal Exchange Theatre in Manchester to dramatise some of the real stories that came from what was really a kind of an amazingly rich story of these soldiers who were plucked from the hell of the trenches and suddenly found themselves in this wonderful historic house, being cared for by not only professional nurses but also by the historic family themselves, who worked and kept detailed notes, and that and the emotional engagement and the connection that we made with people through that skillful piece of programming really demonstrated the power to us of constantly rethinking and thinking of the different stories that programming can highlight and can bring to the surface. But when we start thinking of telling the stories of these places in a more programmatic way, you can see so clearly in things like big events like Winter Lights are fantastic ways of this is by no means unique to the National Trust, but it has proved a wonderful way of reaching new audiences. The audiences we see when we illuminate these places in a dynamic way is completely different to the audience we see when we open them up during the day. And that's important in terms of their ability to serve different types of the community. The picture of people what they're doing on the hilltop is singing on the hilltop indicates that a lot of our programming is done collaboratively with communities and involving people in a much more active way. Can be a real unlocker to how we program with our communities. And the rather quirky picture at the bottom of a pair of feet is just a notion that the way in which we program can be quite simple. Actually, this was an initiative we took in New York, in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. They developed a program called Museum Hack, which is personal interpretation in a really kind of quirky and unusual way. Tours with a difference, and we sent somebody over to New York to bring back the principles of programming our personal interpretation at houses in new ways. And this was at Cork Abbey, where we launched our own Museum Hack version. So this programmatic view has been really important for us in starting to change the way, starting to move our houses into a much more sustainable and interesting space. We've also started to think much more about differentiating the offer. Traditionally, the National Trust has only had one way of approaching. I'm oversimplifying, but in the past, we tended to approach most of our houses in the same way, which is they are recreated country house interiors. And actually, for many of our houses, that is still the best way, or the idea. So when you've got particularly significant collections in designed interiors that have survived miraculously over the centuries, then of course that's how you'd want to present them. But not all houses, that may not be the right solution for all of our houses. So like some of our houses, like in the top right hand corner of this slide, don't have any collections. In the past, we might have responded to that by recreating from scratch our own version of what a historic interior might look like. There are other ways of thinking about this at places like Crewe. The two here are Ray Castle in Cumbria and Barrington Court in Somerset, but these and other places like Croom Park actually working with the interiors in different ways, working with artists, working with communities to put in place interesting installations, might be a different way of thinking about working with these empty spaces. And finally, some of our houses are as here with Thomas Hardy's cottage, or Chartwell, Winston Churchill's house. Some of these are what we call personality houses, where we've got much more of a story to tell about their association with an individual. And some of these might need a much more different narrative-based treatment. So thinking about our houses differently has also been part of a way of thinking about how we constantly move towards this more sustainable future. Okay, I'm going to jump off the National Trust train now and head off into some interesting learning, which this is not something that we are actively working on in the National Trust, but it's some interesting stimulus to help us think about this. And I just wanted, it's one of our partners at Leicester University, Suzanne MacLeod. This is a book that came out in 2020. There's some interesting thinking in here, which could illuminate some of our thinking about how historic buildings might work. She quotes an architect here called Lucian Kroll. And Suzanne's point is, what if we started to think about historic spaces not from theories of the historic environment as our driver, or museums as our academic driver, but as public realm space, and the way in which we think about these places. What if we draw on the theories of how public realm space and works effectively? So in other words, moving from the historic environment as a very specific designed space with a single function, to social space that affords a lot more different types of interaction within it. In the same way, and actually our outdoor spaces are already functioning like this. And what can we learn from the way in which our outdoor spaces are functioning to think about our indoor spaces in new ways? So Susanna's looked at hundreds of different museums and social spaces and historic buildings around the world. And what she's looking for is which of these are most successful at what she's put here, fostering relevance, connection, and engagement. And what are the common characteristics? What can we learn from comparing these places? And she's identified these three attributes as sort of key to our learning from these places. Which he summarizes: open to appropriation, actively foster use, not exchange, care for the collective. What does that mean? Let's have a go. So open to appropriation. Basically, she's found that the most successful historic spaces tend to be places that people are able to make a personal connection with. People feel comfortable. They are able to be themselves within that environment. So she's noted here anti-monumental. One of the issues with big publics, particularly historic houses, is these houses were not designed to be welcoming and comfortable places to visit. Some of them were designed quite the opposite. They were designed to intimidate and impress. So the best places, when she says anti-monumental, she remarks that the best places find ways of undermining or subverting the intimidating nature of the architecture, to put people at their ease, to allow people to function in a much more informal and relaxed way within them. Porous and multifunctional. So they allow different forms of exchange and use to happen within them, and addresses economic inequality, that find ways of subverting the admission charge as the key barrier to entry. She's also noted this idea of actively foster use, not exchange, and there are actually some National Trust examples we can think about here. So basically, what she's saying is that she has observed that the most successful places, rather than imposing a particular set of aesthetic values on the visitors, actually allow different types of interaction, and allow personal and subjective response to the subject matter. So here actually, so the bottom right hand corner, Humankind, was actually a collaborative project with Leicester University, which was about 3 or 4 years ago now. Which is, Colk Abbey is a National Trust property that is a bit of a time capsule house, where the family went into decline, the house began to decay, the family ran out of money, and by the time it came to the National Trust, the last member of the family was was living surrounded by this crumbling house that they no longer had the resources to maintain in 1 or 2 rooms. And so it has that sort of slight air of melancholy, and it has overtones of loneliness and isolation. And what humankind tried to do is to draw on those, if you like, universal truths, those subjectivities, and to program that house around the idea of isolation, loneliness, and inject some really interesting interventions that allowed people to reflect on their own experiences of loneliness and isolation and make connections in new ways. The other one I'd just pick on is Allen Bank, which is in the Lake District, which is quite an early example in the trust. That we first sort of made the transformation of Allen Bank about sort of 8 to 10 years ago, which is, it has no collection of its own, really. What it does have is these fabulous, inspiring views of the Lake District, which have inspired writers and artists and others across the centuries. So really, Allen Bank was turned over to being a place of use, a place where, there are rooms where you can just sit and write or sit and paint, and the walls on the pictures on the walls are not old masters, because Allen Bank doesn't have any old masters. It's pictures that visitors themselves have created. So Allen Bank has become absolutely has become a classic example of a place that fosters use and not exchange. And finally, this idea of places that care for the collective, productive of new relationships, visibly networked, as it says here, but also, as it says here, happiness, frolicking, joyful, playful. How can we sort of how can we create these places that stimulate interaction and joy and community? And there's a few brilliant examples at the bottom right, which is a project we did a few years ago, we were doing some roof work on the major building work on the terrace at Cliveden House, which is a National Trust property in Buckinghamshire, and we just stuck a slide from the top of the scaffolding, which transformed it which made it a much more joyful and playful space. The middle at the bottom, one of my favorite spaces, which is the reading room at the Wellcome Collection, which is really starting to open up the collection to a much more sort of interactive and multifaceted use. And finally, at the bottom left is a place that we've been involved in as an organisation, which is Moseley Road Baths in Birmingham, which is an absolutely stunning example of municipal swimming pool design, which doesn't, which doesn't really. It's such an important piece of heritage. It's expensive and difficult to run as a modern swimming pool, but at the same time, the logic of the building dictates that. But we don't want to lose the building, because it's a really significant building. It serves the local community. It's loved by the local community. But every logic about Moseley Road Baths suggests that the only sustainable future for Moseley Road Baths is a future where people swim in it and the community swims in it. So the formation of this sort of formidable partnership of local community activists, the local authority, National Trust, English Heritage, other funders, to find a sustainable future that still involves people swimming in these baths is a really significant signal for what a sustainable future for heritage might look like. Don't worry, I'm getting there. I'm nearly there. Attingham Park, we've already talked about. A place that has gone from 30,000 visitors over the last 20, 30 years, from 30,000 to 500,000 visits, mainly by fulfilling its stated ambition to be full of life and locally loved, to quote the general manager, and that's been a wonderful case study of how we can use the outdoors to stimulate that kind of local connection. If you live in Shrewsbury, Attingham Park is just your back garden. It's just where you go. You've been stuck inside all weekend. The kids are going up the wall. You're fed up with DIY. We need to get out. Let's just go Attingham. It plays such a vital part in people's lives. And if you talk to people who are local and love this place, Attingham Park is not a place you go on days out. It's a place where your kids took their first faltering steps on their lawn or learned to ride a bike. It's a place where you go for your 5K run every Sunday morning. It's a place where you propose to your wife. It's your place. It's an important part of people's lives, and that feels like what these places need to be. And my final and my favourite example, I think, of a National Trust place that is trying to give us a signal as to the kind of function of that a National Trust might play is one of our smaller places. It's a place called Sutton House in Hackney, in London, which really has kind of it's originally a Tudor house. It hasn't got much in the way of collections, but it has got a fantastic relationship with its local community in terms of events, places for people to learn, to get involved, to interact with each other. It is far more than just a place to visit, and that kind of shared cultural resource for a community is where I would love to see more of our places developing into a sustainable future as we go forward. So that's so I've gone on for an hour now, which I think is quite enough. So I'd like to sort of so if there are any sort of questions or people would like to discuss, I'd be only too pleased to sort of pitch in. How do I stop presenting? There we go.
There we go. Any questions from anybody? Antonella.
A fantastic presentation. Thank you very much. I enjoyed that took a paper of notes about your ideas. So thank you very much. I'm wondering how much in your work is co-created in addition to be inspired by the audiences, because I understood very well that you look at the audiences, you look at their desire, their request, their satisfaction, but how much is created together, invented together with the audiences?
That's a great question, and we know that where we have managed to move ourselves into that co-created space, we know that the impact has been huge. I mean, I can't say that we do it everywhere all the time. It's not easy. We have to build our capability and our practice, but we would certainly aspire to do a lot more. So a place like Sutton House, which I just spoke, is actually quite confident at that and is actually doing that in fairly routinely. Not all of our places have got to that point, but I would love to think that it's something we could get a lot better at over the next few years. But it's a very pertinent and well observed question. Thank you very much.
Ria?
Yes, Mr. Berry, I really enjoyed your talk. You made us all think. I noticed by myself about this how create a sustainable future for our historic buildings, and you gave some proposals which direction we could choose about. It's talking about creating or building up long-term relationships with places instead of attraction activities. So this new vision, this new mission, in the work you do with the National Trust, are there also historic school buildings in your scope? Because in fact, school buildings are places where people do things that are part of their life. They live in it, they study in it. So your new vision is maybe interesting for this kind of heritage.
It's interesting, actually. We have all kinds of stuff. I'm not. I think we probably do own some historic schools, but we don't own any. Although some of our houses, like for example Stowe, are still schools even today, where we own the building, but it's leased to the school. It's interesting, and we have some historic schoolrooms within some of our places, which. But it's interesting, actually. We don't actually care for and present any historic schools. Interesting. That would be a great challenge. I would love to have a go at one of those. But we certainly do at places like Sudbury Hall, where we do have a recreated schoolroom.
Yes, because I'm responsible for the heritage on a large school with protected buildings also, and we're having the same challenges, or we meet the same challenges. So how can we involve our students in being more attentive for the heritage in which they study, and so that's the reason for my question.
One of the things that we've thought about quite a lot, because in the outdoors, it's become clear that the quality of the natural environment can uplift and enhance activities which could take place somewhere else, but which are much better. Like a 5K run is a more uplifting and an enriching experience if it's in. And I'm really interested in the idea that actually the historic environment too can lift and enhance. So in other words, the activity of learning in a historic environment, I'm really interested in what's the benefit of that. How does the historic environment actually add practical enrichment and benefit to activity? And that's that. I would love to explore that a lot more for in all kinds of ways.
Okay.
That's a really interesting question.
That's good. Any other questions?
Oh, looks like I've got off lightly.
It looks like you have, Tony, yes. Just a comment, not a question from me, Tony, but just a comment. Obviously, I'm the only one here, I think, bar one other that's based in the UK. So my knowledge of the National Trust is quite extensive, and a member myself visited a lot of the buildings and estates.
God bless you, sir.
But it was very interesting to hear that perspective in terms of sustainability and the reuse and the reimagination, and certainly things like, when I've been to Belton House and seen the light shows there, I just go and appreciate, from a user experience, just appreciate the light show with my family and children. But I suppose I don't stop and think through the process that has gone on to reimagine the house in that order, and similarly when I've gone to places like Southall Workhouse, and there've been recreations there, where there've actually been actors dressed up, to actually look at how you see it has been very interesting, and a real insight into the workings of the National Trust, which is, you know, as you said right at the beginning, I would suspect for many people, many lay people, that their thoughts and imaginations of the National Trust is actually as an attraction, a day out, and it's obviously much more than that. So that's very interesting. Thank you very much.
I mean, and it's still clearly it still is a day out.
It's still a day out, yes.
Particularly if you're one of our places in the southwest of England, in Cornwall and Devon. But so I'm not saying we shouldn't be days out. I'm just saying that we should. We can be. There's other stuff as well.
Yes, a lot more to it. That's good.
Thank you.
Right, if that's it, I think we can let you go and have your well-earned lunch, Tony.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a pleasure to join you. Thank you for
thank you so much for giving up your time. Thank you.
No problem. Bye now.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.